Imagine just like ripping $165 billion out of the global trade system overnight.
You'd expect a total disaster, right?
Right. I mean, you would expect a massive global recession.
Hmm.
Factories shutting down, empty shelves, just absolute panic in the markets.
Oh, for sure. Total chaos.
But what if, instead of collapsing, total global trade actually grew?
Which sounds completely impossible.
It really does. But today, we are looking at a world where the old rules of economics and geopolitics are just, well, they're completely broken. And world leaders are essentially playing this high-stakes game of poker while entirely blindfolded.
Yeah, it is a incredibly disorienting time to be paying attention. The structural realities that businesses, governments, and just everyday citizens have relied on for decades are genuinely shifting beneath our feet. We are essentially moving from a system optimized for pure efficiency to one that is, just bracing for impact.
Okay, let's unpack this, because for this deep dive, we are zeroing in on a really massive April 2026 paper by Farid Novin.
It's quite a read.
It really is. The title alone kind of sets the whole stage. It's called After the Liberal Order, Democratic Erosion, Strategic Independence, and Bayesian Geopolitics of a Fragmented World 2026 to 2050.
Yeah, quite a mouthful.
Seriously, but the core premise here is a complete paradigm shift. For decades, the liberal international order, free trade, democratic norms, multinational alliances, it was viewed as a universal project.
Right, it was treated like gravity.
Exactly. Like it was just inevitably going to spread across the entire globe. It was just a matter of time.
And the fundamental argument of this research is that the era of universal expansion is over.
It's just done.
Yeah. The liberal order hasn't completely collapsed, but it has fractured into what the author calls a competitive identity.
A competitive identity.
I mean, it is now just one of several completely different operating systems fighting for legitimacy on the world stage.
Right.
It's not the default anymore.
Wow. And to understand how these systems are clashing, we are going to explore how domestic political erosion, like right within established democracies, is actively rewiring global supply chains.
Because that panic is creating new, intense battlegrounds over the physical elements and the digital brains of the future.
Right, specifically critical minerals and artificial intelligence. And finally, we will break down the actual game theory of how world leaders are making decisions when they basically have no idea what their rivals are going to do next.
Because you really can't understand the fracturing of the global map without first looking at the internal fractures happening inside the nations that built that map.
That makes sense.
If the internal engine of a democracy is stalling out, that country can no longer afford to champion free global trade or underwrite international security. They have to pull back and protect themselves.
And the data on this internal stalling is staggering. I mean, the research leans heavily on the 2026 Democracy Report from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, or VDEM.
A really crucial source.
Yeah, and for a long time, the prevailing wisdom in political science was that once a country reached a certain level of wealth, became an advanced industrialized democracy, it was structurally immune to sliding backward into autocracy.
It had reached the finish line.
Right. But that was the assumption. The empirical findings in the 2026 VDEM report shatter that illusion entirely.
They really do. Currently, 25% of all states globally are actively autocratizing.
25%?
Yeah, a quarter of the world. But here is the mechanism that really changes the geopolitical calculus. 6 out of the 10 newly autocratizing countries are located in Europe and North America.
Wait, 6 out of 10? In Europe and North America?
Exactly. We are seeing a geographic inversion. The foundation is cracking at the core of the global system, not just out on the periphery.
That is wild. And the data zeroes in on the United States specifically, noting an unprecedented 24% decline in its liberal democracy index during the first year of the second Trump administration.
It's a massive shift.
And just to show how that registers with the public, a March 2026 Pew Research survey found that 68% of Americans believe their democracy is no longer a model for the rest of the world.
Which is a huge psychological turning point.
It is. Now, I do want to jump in and make something really important note for you listening. The researchers at VDEM and Pew, they are looking at this purely as raw data.
Right, absolutely.
They aren't making a partisan argument or taking a political side, and neither are we. We are strictly, impartially reporting the VDEM and Pew data precisely as the source material presents it.
Yeah, they are essentially structural engineers looking for stress fractures in a building.
Perfect way to put it. And the data they're reporting shows an objective, extreme stress test on the system.
And that stress test has a profound geopolitical fallout. I mean, look at Europe. They are facing a massive structural dilemma of their own. Take Germany, for example.
The industrial powerhouse.
Exactly, for generations. But right now, they are losing 10,000 manufacturing jobs every single month.
Wait, per month? Not per year.
Per month. 10,000 a month. And in a shift that is incredibly symbolic of this whole new era, for the first time in modern history, Germany now imports more automobiles from China than it exports to the Chinese market.
Wow. If you are sitting in Berlin or Brussels, that isn't just an economic statistic, that is an existential threat.
Oh, entirely.
So are they just sitting back and watching this happen, or is there some kind of immune response kicking in?
Well, there is an attempted immune response. European Union institutions are trying to build walls. You see initiatives like the Democracy Shield program and the Council of Europe's new Democratic Pact.
Okay, so they're trying to do something.
Yeah, they're desperately trying to bolster independent journalism and democratic integrity. But the tragedy of these institutional defenses is that they're trying to protect a system from political forces that are gaining immense ground legally right inside their own borders.
It really makes me think of a giant legacy tech company.
How so?
Well, is this like a massive corporation where the company culture rots from the inside out? You know, the top talent leaves, the internal departments are constantly sabotaging each other.
Right.
And all of this is happening years before the actual stock price craters and competitors take over their market share.
What's fascinating here is we could push that analogy even further because it's not just about talent leaving. Imagine if the board of directors of that tech company started legally rewriting the corporate bylaws so they could never be fired.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like defunding the internal auditors, silencing whistleblower protections, all while still holding quarterly shareholder meetings to pretend everything is totally normal.
Just keeping up appearances.
Exactly. That is exactly what the paper describes as executive aggrandizement.
Executive aggrandizement, that's a crucial term. Let's dig into how that actually works on a state level.
It is the defining mechanism of modern democratic erosion. Just really rarely a military coup with tanks rolling down the streets anymore.
Right, it's more subtle.
Much more subtle. It involves leaders who retain complete electoral legitimacy. They are legitimately voted into power. But once inside, they use the legal tools of the state to gradually dismantle the checks and balances.
So they're changing the rules from within.
Precisely. They subtly change the rules for how judges are appointed. They politicize the civil service. They slowly hollow out the substantive foundations of liberalism, but they keep the outer shell of democracy entirely intact.
And the research shows that once you start dismantling those internal alarms, it is incredibly hard to reverse course, isn't it?
Carnegie Endowment data confirms this aggressively. Since 1990, of 25 countries that experienced this kind of democratic backsliding, only 4 managed to achieve a sustained recovery.
Only 4 out of 25?
Yeah. And only a single country, Sri Lanka, has maintained that recovery beyond a 5-year horizon.
That is sobering.
It demonstrates a severe path dependence. Once the structural guardrails are removed, the momentum is aggressively working against your ability to rebuild them.
So if the established democracies are entirely consumed by this internal rot and protectionist panic, that panic instantly bleeds into the global supply chain.
It has to.
Because the old system was completely obsessed with price efficiency.
Yeah.
You had multinational corporations hunting the globe to find the absolute cheapest place to manufacture a sneaker or an iPhone.
Right, the Washington Consensus.
Yeah. But now we are forcefully rewiring the entire map of global trade away from efficiency and strictly toward pure geopolitics.
We are literally witnessing the death of the Washington Consensus. For decades, the rule was that governments should stay out of the way of free markets. Let the market decide.
Exactly.
Today, tariffs, massive state subsidies, and aggressive export controls are the primary weapons of economic statecraft. Geopolitics is no longer something that happens to the market. Geopolitics is the architecture of the market.
And this brings us back to that massive paradox I mentioned right at the start.
The $165 billion.
Yes. By late 2025, United States tariffs hit their highest point since the Second World War. And McKinsey Global Institute data shows these measures displaced over $165 billion in trade flows between the U.S. and China.
A staggering number.
But global trade didn't collapse. It actually increased. I mean, if these massive tariffs were designed to punish a rival and bring jobs home, how did ripping $165 billion out of the world's most important trade corridor result in a net positive for global trade volume?
It's a fascinating mechanical reality of global supply chains. When you impose tariffs on a systemic scale, you don't magically destroy consumer demand in the United States.
People still want to buy stuff.
Exactly. Nor do you destroy the industrial capacity to produce those goods in China. You simply change the geometry of how those two forces connect.
Okay, so the U.S. managed to replace about 2/3 of those reduced Chinese imports by just turning to alternatives. Meanwhile, China, suddenly facing this massive wall blocking their access to the American consumer, they just dropped their export prices by an average of 8% to forcefully push their excess goods into new markets.
Exactly. Multinational firms aren't going to just stop selling things. If a Chinese firm wants to reach the American market without paying a crippling tariff, they will route their supply chains through politically acceptable third countries.
Oh, like a detour.
Precisely. They will build a final assembly factory in Vietnam or Mexico. That is why the ASEAN economies in Southeast Asia became the massive winners in this geoeconomic tug-of-war.
They just became the middlemen.
Yeah, they positioned themselves as the necessary middlemen, deepening trade relationships with both Washington and Beijing simultaneously. The trade didn't disappear, it just added a highly lucrative detour.
Wow. But while Southeast Asia is booming, the European Union is getting crushed by what the research calls a double squeeze.
It's brutal for Europe right now.
Let's look at the mechanics of this. On one side, because China dropped its prices to find new buyers, Europe is facing an absolute flood of lower-cost Chinese industrial imports hitting their domestic market.
Which hurts their own manufacturing.
Right. And then on the other side, European exports to the United States are hitting those elevated U.S. tariff barriers.
It is the worst possible position for an export-driven economy like Germany. Europe attempted to stabilize the bleeding through the Turnberry deal with the United States. They desperately needed regulatory predictability.
But the cost of that predictability was astronomical. The Turnberry deal ended up blocking EU exports at a 15% tariff rate. Just a year prior, in 2025, that rate was only 8.5%.
Yeah, a massive jump.
They essentially surrendered their global competitiveness just to stop the uncertainty.
Which perfectly illustrates the new reality. The architecture of global trade is no longer a flat map where water simply flows to the lowest price. It is now a highly complex topographic map of political alliances, tariff walls, and choke points.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this rewiring of global supply chains isn't just about consumer goods anymore. It's not just about cars and sneakers.
No, the stakes are much higher.
The real existential battleground has shifted to the foundational infrastructure of the future. We are talking about the physical elements, critical minerals, and the digital brain's artificial intelligence.
These domains are where strategic competition is the absolute most acute. They are the non-substitutable building blocks of the 21st century economy.
You literally can't build the future without them.
Right. Without critical minerals, you simply cannot build a green energy grid, and you cannot maintain a modern military.
Look at what happened at the 2025 G7 Kananaskis Summit. World leaders formally declared that critical minerals are central to collective economic security.
And we saw exactly why that is so urgent just a few months prior to that, in April 2025.
Right after the U.S. escalated its tariffs, China completely flexed its muscles and restricted the export of several heavy rare earth elements and magnet technologies.
It was a stark warning. China maintains dominant control over the processing capacity for these elements. By selectively restricting them, Beijing demonstrated the terrifying coercive potential embedded in these supply chains.
Basically saying, we can turn you off.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call, forcing the G7 states to realize they don't just need free trade. They need a strategic supply chain architecture.
So they are now scrambling to artificially subsidize new non-Chinese suppliers.
Yes, and create price stabilization mechanisms, just so those new mines don't get deliberately undercut and driven out of business by Beijing dropping prices again.
Wow. And then you have the digital side of the infrastructure, artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
AI is no longer viewed as just a technology policy issue, right? The data frames it as geopolitical infrastructure.
That's a crucial distinction.
And we are currently watching the world splinter into three completely competing, almost entirely incompatible ecosystems.
Yes.
First, you have the European Union model. They are obsessed with high regulation and what they call digital sovereignty. They passed the AI Act in August 2024 to regulate AI across its entire life cycle, prioritizing auditability and human rights.
Then you have the U.S. model, which is much more fragmented. It's heavily reliant on the private sector and aggressively innovation-centric.
They don't want anyone slowing them down.
Right. The U.S. government is so fundamentally opposed to a centralized global regulatory system that might slow down their tech giants that they actually boycotted the November 2025 G20 AI task force in South Africa.
I remember that. And finally, you have China. They are pushing an entirely different model focused on state sovereignty and capacity building.
And they are aggressively exporting this model. It's perfectly tailored for the global south, mostly operated through the United Nations.
I want to try an analogy here because the way these different regions are treating AI reminds me of the electric grid back in the 1920s.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah. You had all these different regional power companies building grids with completely incompatible voltages and completely different plugs.
Right, a total mess.
But with AI, it's not just about annoying plugs. AI compute infrastructure, the advanced semiconductors, the massive data centers, that is the modern electric grid.
Absolutely.
So when a country uses export controls to restrict who gets access to advanced semiconductors, they're basically a state deciding who gets to turn the lights on for the next industrial revolution.
The 1920s grid is a great way to look at it, but let's take it a step further to really capture the geopolitical threat.
Okay, lay on me.
It's as if you didn't just have different plugs, but the power company could instantly turn off the electricity to your specific house at any moment, simply because they didn't like your foreign policy.
Oh, wow. That is terrifying.
That is why digital sovereignty is now a near universal goal. No state wants their critical economic or military infrastructure controlled by an incompatible ecosystem that could be weaponized against them.
So we have this global landscape where domestic politics are rotting from the inside, global trade is being forcibly rerouted through tariff walls, and the foundational technologies of the future are splintering into incompatible, weaponized systems.
That's a lot to navigate.
It really is. If you are a world leader, how do you actually make a decision in this environment when all the old rules of the liberal order are gone and you don't know if your rivals are going to cooperate or cut off your rare earths?
This is where the research gets incredibly analytical. It uses Bayesian game theory to explain how leaders navigate this chaos.
Game theory.
It is a phenomenal analytical lens. In traditional game theory, like chess, you often assume perfect information. You can see all the pieces on the board.
Right, nothing is hidden.
But in a Bayesian game, actors operate under conditions of severe incomplete information. You don't actually know the true type of the other players. You don't know their real domestic constraints, their red lines, or their actual long-term objectives.
So they're flying blind.
Pretty much. So leaders have to make high-stakes decisions based on probabilistic beliefs, and they continuously update those mathematical probabilities based on the fuzzy, confusing signals the other players send.
The analysis divides the world into three specific state types. Let's break those down.
Sure.
First, you have Type L, the status quo liberal states. Think of countries like France, Canada, and Japan.
Right. They are still trying desperately to defend the old rule-based multilateral system.
Then you have Type A, the strategic autonomous states. This is the EU as a whole, the UK, and Germany. They still use liberal cooperative language, but underneath, they prioritize domestic resilience and are quietly decoupling from rivals.
Exactly. And finally, Type R, the revisionist illiberal states. This is primarily China and Russia, who actively want to displace the liberal order entirely.
Okay, so L, A, and R.
And here is the massive mechanical problem the international system faces right now. It's what game theorists call a pooling equilibrium.
Let me try to translate that. A pooling equilibrium is basically a poker game where a player who is completely bluffing with a terrible hand and a player who is holding a royal flush both bet the exact same amount of money with the exact same body language.
That's a spot-on analogy.
They pool their behaviors together, making it mathematically impossible for the opponent to know if they're walking into a trap or if they can easily win the pot.
Exactly. And the global stage right now is trapped in a massive pooling equilibrium
How so?
because the United States frequently relies on type A strategies like throwing up massive tariff walls, but simultaneously acts highly unpredictably due to its own domestic political turmoil. So it almost mimics type R disruptive behavior.
Oh, I see.
Meanwhile, the EU is deploying very aggressive trade defense mechanisms, which is also confusing.
So if you are a Type R actor, like China, looking across the table at the West, you get a completely blurred signal.
Completely.
You can't tell if you are facing a weak, declining Type L state that you can easily push around and coerce, or if you are facing a hardened Type A state that will aggressively fight back.
And that ambiguity is the most dangerous thing in international relations.
Yeah.
Because it encourages Type R actors to probe.
To test the waters.
They test the boundaries. They do something aggressive just to see what the response is. Every probe generates new information to update their Bayesian probability. But in such a noisy, chaotic environment, signals constantly get misinterpreted.
Which brings us to a terrifyingly specific date the paper highlights, the 2026 U.S. midterm elections.
Yes.
The author argues this isn't just a domestic political event, it's the ultimate global data point. If the election is procedurally compromised, or if the results are contested and chaotic, it signals to revisionist actors that the U.S. is permanently drifting away from institutional stability.
It is essentially a giant green light for them to take aggressive action.
So let me ask you, if everyone is hiding behind a pooling equilibrium, bluffing and sending mixed signals, what is the actual tangible cost if a leader completely misreads the room?
This raises an important question, and it's the crux of the geopolitical tightrope. The research defines this as the cost of misclassification.
The cost of misclassification.
Yeah. When the resources at stake are non-substitutable, meaning you literally cannot build your fighter jets or power your cities without them, the cost of inferring the wrong type is catastrophic.
Because you can't just buy them somewhere else.
Right. If you assume a hostile Type R actor is actually a rational, cooperative partner, you expose yourself to sudden, devastating coercion at the exact moment you need resilience the most.
Just like Europe assuming they could rely on cheap energy.
Yes.
Or the G7 assuming they would always have access to heavy rare earths right up until Beijing flipped the switch.
Precisely. If the G7 wants to survive this fragmented era, the paper argues they must prioritize proof-of-type mechanisms.
Meaning they have to prove who they are.
They have to break out of the pooling equilibrium by sending credible, costly signals that they are strategic autonomists. They need to prove they are capable of defending their supply chains and unifying around AI governance without demanding that every single ally pass a rigid ideological purity test. They have to prove they aren't bluffing.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? The ultimate takeaway from Fareed Novin's trajectory for the next 25 years is that the defining characteristic of our era is a fundamental, unavoidable shift from efficiency to resilience.
It's a completely new mindset.
For decades, the entire goal of business and government was to eliminate friction to maximize profit. Now, the research argues that controlled inefficiency is the most rational investment anyone can make.
Absolutely.
Intentionally paying 30% more for a critical supply chain that won't get arbitrarily cut off by a foreign adversary isn't a financial loss. It is a required security premium.
And this brings us to a highly provocative thought from the paper's conclusion regarding how markets often completely misinterpret these shifts.
Oh, this part is wild.
Yeah. Look back at May 2025. There was a major U.S.-China tariff truce. Tariffs were dropped to 30% and 10%.
I remember the markets went crazy.
Yeah, but markets absolutely cheered. Business sentiment skyrocketed. Institutional investors acted like the system was finally stabilizing.
They saw de-escalation. They saw a return to the old rules.
They saw exactly what they desperately wanted to see. But the research asks a chilling question. What if the private sector is disastrously misinterpreting short-term transactional truces as long-term peace?
Wow.
What if, beneath the surface of these temporary stock market rallies, world governments are actually quietly locking into what game theorists call a perfect Bayesian equilibrium of conflict?
Meaning they have run the probabilities, and they have rationally accepted that true cooperation is simply too risky. So permanent containment is the only viable long-term strategy, and they are just buying time to build higher walls.
Exactly. A world where everyone understands the bluff and everyone accepts that the board has permanently flipped.
Wow. It completely reframes how you look at a positive headline about global trade or a new technology pact. It really leaves you questioning the structural integrity of everything around
It
us.
does make you think twice.
So, as you go about the rest of your day, I want you to consider this. Are the systems you rely on in your own life, your career trajectory, your investments, your community infrastructure, built for the old world of maximum fragile efficiency?
Or are they built for resilience?
Exactly. Or are they built for resilience in a world where the rules are constantly being rewritten? Something to think about. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.